So welcome to another episode of the NHS Success Circle podcast. This is where we share real stories and honest advice to help overseas doctors settle, succeed and grow in the NHS. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome someone truly special, Mr. Matt Hanson. Mr. Hanson is a highly respected colorectal surgeon in the UK. He brings not just experience and skill, but also sharp clinical judgment, a calm presence, and a real passion for teaching and supporting others. Patients trust him, colleagues respect him, and junior doctors feel safe, supported around him. And what makes Mr. Hanson even more inspiring is his dedication beyond medicine. He has completed multiple marathons and triathlons, not only to stay fit and healthy, but also to raise money for charity. He's also passionate about classic cars and loves attending car shows whenever he gets a chance. And when he's not in operating theatre or behind a wheel of something vintage, you'll probably find him traveling, exploring a new place all over the world. Today, he is here to share his honest thoughts, personal experience, and practical advice on how overseas doctors can do better in the NHS, especially in a high-pressure area like operating theatres, clinics, and ward rounds. He'll also talk about some of the common struggles he's seen, what overseas doctors can do to avoid trouble, and how to build a career that's not just safe but also fulfilling. So let's dive in. Welcome, Mr. Hanson, and thank you for giving us your valuable time to talk to us today about your experience and how to help overseas doctors.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm absolutely delighted. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So from your experience dealing with overseas doctors, what do you think the biggest challenge that they face when they land to the UK, especially when they get their first job?
Well, I think I'd actually probably take it back a step further, actually, because actually getting a job within the NHS, I think, is actually tremendously difficult sometimes because of the competition for the places. So, in fact, knowledge about the place and the location and the particular trust that people are actually trying to apply to, I think, is actually vital. That's before you actually even start applying for roles and jobs within the NHS. I think once a job has been gained, communication and learning the system is going to be of paramount importance. And I think that that's where a lot of the difficulty actually comes from for international medical graduates.
Could you elaborate more on this, please?
So I think, first of all, I mean, the real basic of the communication side of things is language. And there are plenty of people who have got a good basic knowledge of English, which, of course, is absolutely vital. But there's a lot of nuance to the language, and particularly with medical language. And I think that it's very important to have that level above the basic. It is crucial, really, to be able to talk at the same level as doctors who are already practicing in England. And when it comes to medicine, it's very easy to have a lack of understanding, which becomes very apparent when you're delivering excellent patient care.
Thank you for elaborating on this. But what would you say the thing that they should really try and master first when they first start their first job in the UK? Because it always makes a difference when they start sorting their first job. They can get reference so they can continue their career. What's the thing that you've seen them doing wrong that you would say, actually, I would prefer if they've done this and this and that for them to be able to have a good presence and a good foundation for their first job in the UK?
Okay, so I think there's many aspects to that. I think that a lot of the international trainees that we've seen are actually very highly qualified. They're of a very good level, a very good standard. It's the transition of moving from what they've understood in their own countries and the system that's been in place and how they've been taught and been brought up, and then transferring those skills over to the UK and the NHS, I think, is probably the biggest difficulty. The system is clearly very different, not only to the way that the system was in the UK 20, 30 years ago, which is what was modelled in a lot of other countries at that point in time. It's transformed a lot, and I think that people are really quite surprised and shocked about how the system works in such a different way. And I think that is one of the biggest difficulties that people face when they come over. The system is different. It's not what they thought it was going to be. And if you haven't got the ability to communicate at a high level, then that lack of communication skills and the difficulty understanding the system really contributes to a lot of problems. So it's not usually medical knowledge.
Great.
It's not the quality or caliber of the people that are applying, which we all know is very high. It is more about the subtleties of understanding the system and the communication that you need.
Thank you for elaborating on this as well. And communication is a big thing. Communicating with colleagues, with nurses, with, patients, patient family. It's all communication. And sometimes I find it difficult for overseas doctors to know where even to start.
Yeah.
It's a learning journey for them. And this, what I'm trying to introduce, which is mentoring for overseas doctors. Do you think the NHS is doing enough to mentor these doctors? The NHS is now running mainly on a lot of doctors in some areas, but they're relying on them a lot in many subspecialties.
So I think there's a lot of variability actually in how it's done, and this, when you're a graduate and a trainee and in a training position in the UK, there is a very structured pathway of education, mentorship, clinical governance with a clinical supervisor, educational supervisor, and your deanery. Sure. It's very tightly run. There's a lot of administration that goes with that. And for overseas doctors, it is much less. They don't have that same level of structure. And in fact, what we find is that at different local trusts, there are a huge variation in the way that those overseas doctors are actually treated, if you like. Some will have really good mentorship programs. Some will not have any at all. Yeah. So there's a big variability, and it is important to understand when you're applying for jobs what that kind of support will be in the trust that you're actually applying to. There are certain trusts, like our trust, BHR, who in the surgical division have actually had an academy of surgery, and that's been very well run, not by myself, but by colleagues who have had a vested interest. And that is actually done very well, and there is a mentorship program that goes along with that. And every year there will be an appraisal process that people will need to go through.
That's good.
It is not quite the same as on the training grades and on through the deanery, but it's certainly something which gives people the ability to have contact with people, to go through things, explain their lack of knowledge or misunderstandings, and to also allow that level of communication where people can explain what might not be quite right. So I think that's very good, and it varies an awful lot. So I think that's a very strong message to find out what that level of support is actually at that trust.
I'm trying actually also to raise awareness. Thanks for pointing this out. Within the NHS hospitals as well and NHS organisation, that you need these doctors to come and help the community, to help the NHS to survive and thrive. But you need to look after them as well. So they came here to do a job, earn money, of course, have a different lifestyle. But at the same time, you need to look after them so they can provide you the service that you really want. So what would you say if a doctor... you say they should ask if there's mentorship. Now it's really difficult for overseas doctors to get a job. And I'm sure you advertise for a job and you find like 100 or 500 applicants for one single job.
So, in fact, actually, my wife, who's a doctor in medicine, she has had an FY2, so that's a very junior doctor, second year after completion of training, for a general medical job in East London. And within 20 minutes of the advert going live, there were over 1,000 applicants.
So it's even worse.
1,000 in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Now, that suggests to me, and I don't know this for certain, but it certainly would appear that there must be agencies who are probably set up with computers. People have sent their CVs in, and as soon as a job becomes available, then those agencies just blanket apply on behalf of the doctors. And there's a tendency for the hospitals to then close those adverts because there are so many applicants.
Of course.
Which is a difficult thing to do, but it is a very competitive field, and just to highlight that is actually an important message that there's a lot of interest in any kind of job that comes along. So anything that makes you stand out, any experience in the UK is very important, and make it apparent on the CVs, and try not to just use an agency that just blanket fills your CVs in, because they just get rejected without even being looked at properly.
Well, thanks for mentioning that. On mentioning UK experience, which is something that people really want to demonstrate on their application form, but they are in this loophole where they've come from overseas, they've got their registration sorted, applying for jobs, they're finding they are one of 1,000, are not getting any ability to have UK experience. So how could they manage this? What's your idea on how?
Well, it's not easy, quite frankly. There are lots of jobs that are oversubscribed, and how do you actually stand out? And there is no easy answer to that. If you don't have the experience, the knowledge, if you don't have the right CV, then it's very unlikely that you'll end up getting a job in the UK. And that's the reality of it. And I think that maybe there are a lot of people that don't understand that. So to be able to put yourself into the actual mix, if you like, to actually have the ability and the CV, you do need experience. Now, whether or not that's something that you can gain outside of the UK, if there are some places that do additional training, teaching, is one thing. But alternatively, people have to make the effort to actually get appointments, fellowships, other ways in to actually get some experience in the UK. Even then, it might not be enough. Okay. If you haven't actually worked at a trust, to get a job at a trust often requires experience. So there's going to be some sacrifice along the way, and there's the people that go that extra mile that will actually get into the system. Yeah. So it's the dedication, it's the additional stuff which you may well end up having to work without pay for a little while.
Yeah. Like honorary contracts, was that?
Honorary contracts, yeah. Making the time, making the effort, being in the UK, actually doing additional research, trying to get onto some sort of academic program. Yeah. If you can get onto things like the academic surgery or various things similar in different trusts, then that's the way in. But it's too easy to have a CV and you're not even going to be in the market really for a job.
That's really insightful. I think we have to address it's difficult now to get into any job in the UK, and you have to stand out.
Yeah.
And you kindly mentioned a couple of ways that people could stand out in their CV and their application process. And I'm sure there will be other ways that we will discuss along our conversation today to help them to, improve their CV and probability of getting a job. But once they got a job, and you said ask for mentorship, let's assume they got a job, now ask for mentorship.
Yeah.
And there's no mentorship. What do you think they should do? Well, there's no mentorship in the hospital they are employed in. And I think they were not going to ask in the interview if there's any support for me afterward, because now they are struggling to get a job. So they're not going to ask these questions. They're going to accept the job and then go in, but land in a place where there's no mentorship or support.
Yeah, I think... I suppose one thing that would be helpful if you don't need mentorship within your own hospital. There will be societies that will offer support for junior doctors or more senior doctors, and it would be very important to actually link with those, share experience. And it may well, and I personally don't know this, but it may well be that there are places online, various social forums, where people will be able to share their experiences and get some support. So that's a form of sharing and mentorship. There will be people that not necessarily in the same specialities that might offer mentorship within that trust or at local trusts nearby. And I think that people should try and seek that kind of level of help if it's not available in the trust. And that would be a shame if it's not, because it should be. If they're employing overseas doctors and international medical graduates, they should be looked after, I think. It's very important.
Thanks for sharing this. I think you've highlighted something important. Look for mentorship. Ask for mentorship in the interview if you think you're at this position. And if you join and there's no mentorship, you should seek mentorship, different departments, different hospital, different trust, or even online forums, or any specialized, organization which could help them to have mentorship in the NHS. Thank you for sharing that.
I also think it's important that if you're in the right job, in the right trusts, and I understand that if you've got a job, you don't want to ask awkward questions or put stipulations that might seem as though you're going to be an awkward candidate. But in fact, most places, if you ask the question in the right way, would probably understand that you recognize that actually that's a potential weakness. And the fact that you're actually asking for whether or not there's any mentorship programs will sometimes come across as a positive aspect to your application.
Well, thanks for highlighting that.
No, I think that's very true. I mean, if I was interviewing someone as an overseas candidate and they actually said to me, I'm very keen, I really want to do the job, I'm going to work hard, all the rest of it. Everyone says that. They also say, I also appreciate that I don't have a huge amount of experience in the UK, and I was just wondering if there's actually any support services, mentorships. And that kind of question is sometimes very valid and will be taken the right way, usually, in an interview.
Well, that's because you're a sensible person, but not everyone on the interview panel are sensible like you. But, thanks for highlighting this. I think it is about how to communicate the question. The way you said it will sound very genuine, will be kind of falling in good ears in the interview panel, and I'm sure they will be taken in a positive way. So it's all about communication as well, going to the first thing.
It's about asking for help, and there's nothing wrong about asking for help, and that actually is one aspect that we might touch on in our further discussions. It's not about demanding. So there's a difference between asking, saying, I want mentorship, can you give it to me in this role, and just saying, I recognise that this might be a weakness, and I was wondering if there's any support services or mentorship. And putting it in a different way actually puts a very different light on it. And so people would see that as a positive attitude to understand that you might need some support and help along the way, as long as it's not seen as demanding, which of course then would be taken as a negative way.
Absolutely. Thanks for highlighting this point as well. One of the things which I find other doctors talking to other doctors, they say about overseas doctors is they lack documentation. They're not good in documentation. I'm not sure if you've seen this in your practice, and if you have, you could share one of the examples and maybe guide at the end on how to do a proper or good documentation. Because it's something, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but I've heard from other doctors that when they do an honorary job or they do attachment, they always get criticized on their documentation. So there should be an art for it, and there's no better one to ask than you about how to do documentation.
I might beg to differ, but a couple of aspects. I think personal documentation and trainees from overseas often have a lot of information about what they've done themselves. So their personal documentation about themselves, their CVs, is often exemplary and often way better than UK candidates. And it may well be that people are a little bit more independent rather than the UK trainees who have had a lot of help with systems and IT and the admin and the deanery that kind of helped them along the way to do that. Regarding documentation on the wards and in patients' notes, this is a big thing. And I suppose it depends on the background country where a trainee might be coming from. But the legal system in the UK has changed, and it's becoming much more likely that patients will be able to complain about certain things and take things through a complaints process. And often the legal team needs to get involved. And we're finding that that's become much more commonplace. Now, documentation is therefore critical, and we found that in the past it's been fairly poorly done in terms of basic things like times, dates, who was there on the ward rounds, an accurate reflection of what was actually done and said at that point in time. And that, although it seems very boring, suddenly becomes the most crucial bit of information if there is any problems, which then leads to a complaint or, in fact, a legal proceeding. And, in fact, quite regularly, and even this week in our morbidities and mortalities meeting, we had a presentation for audit documentation, and that runs constantly. So our juniors who change over almost every year, we've got another set of juniors that will come in and do that audit on documentation, checking to make sure everything's factual and done correctly. And I think that has been a problem in the past with UK trainees who are now much hotter on it, but with international trainees, maybe depending on which country they come from and the background about the patient's rights and complaints may have a slight different perspective on how accurate and what's involved in that note-taking and documentation side of things.
Thank you for sharing that. So what counts as a good or proper documentation? What does it look like? Good documentation for listeners who haven't worked here in the UK yet or about to take their first job and they don't know actually, they've come from a different country, they do documentation in a different way. What is a good documentation in the UK?
Yeah, so I mean, it can be very simple, but it always requires a date and a time. There's usually a documentation about what the situation is. So say if it's a ward round. Usually the most senior person leading the ward round would be titled at the top of that. And then it's a question of what's actually done during that. And often for a ward round, there'll be the kind of the symptoms and then the observations, then the assessment, and then a plan. So there's an analogy, which is soap. Which is commonly used for us. There are lots of others, and I'm sure people are aware of various forms of doing that. So that's very important to get that right. And there will be variations in whoever leads a ward round as to the trust that they have in that person, that trainee, or the doctor that's actually documented that. And if you are new or if they don't know you, then you may well find that they will actually come and check to see what you've actually written, because that senior person will recognise how important that documentation is. That may well be not always the case. If it's a very straightforward and routine ward round, it could be quite brief, but sometimes there needs to be very accurate reflection. And the plan can be very important to make sure that that's documented carefully. Not only that, then what happens afterwards is the signature, which needs to be legible.
Okay.
And any kind of like identifying numbers, like a GMC number, needs to go down there as well. Hospitals have often given people stamps to actually stamp their name in the notes as well, which it saves a lot of time and hassle writing things out by capitals. But that's the level of detail and expectation that we should have. It's also important that any relevant information regarding things like blood tests, scans, go into the notes as well. Absolutely. Special scans. The plan as well. I think sometimes there needs to be documentation about timing, because to say, for example, we need a CT scan. Okay, just CT scan. Okay, well, what are we doing CT scan for? You need to explain what that CT is for and the timing of it, because someone might need a CT next week. Or they might need it now. So an identification and documentation about the speed and urgency is often required within the notes, and that can be important as well later on when you come back to look back on these things. And then, and what is often forgotten to be done is to come back at the end of the day and actually ensure that what's been planned has been done and is then documented. I can't tell you the number of times where people have said, do blood tests, and the blood tests are done, and then they're not checked. And then suddenly the next day when you come on the ward round, we look at these abnormal blood tests, which we wish we'd known about
yesterday,
the previous day. So I think it's very important to close that circle. So if you ask for an investigation, the expectation is it done that day, that you make sure it's done, you've got the reports, and if necessary, you've flagged it up, highlighted it to your seniors if necessary, and then acted on it as well. So,
would you know any specific app or software or program that can help junior doctors, overseas doctors, or non-overseas to keep all these tasks so they can check it? Because it can be overwhelming sometimes with a big sheet or writing in papers.
So there were apps, and I can't remember the names of them. And there are multiple apps that I am aware of actually on Apple iPhones and and Samsung Galaxies. But in fact, most hospital trusts will not want you to use independent software like that because of the risk of confidentiality, and I think that's important to know. So most of the hospitals now are spending a lot of money on IT systems, and in fact, our own hospital trust are pushing towards an EPR, an electronic patient recognition system or record, which is costing millions of pounds. And a lot of the documentation, the result systems will be on that. The expectation is that the juniors will use that IT system within each in-hospital trust. Again, important to say that every hospital trust is its own essential business, even though it's part of the NHS. So you will find, depending on which hospital you work at, lots of different systems,
Of course, yeah.
lots of different IT programs,
absolutely.
which will be specific to that local
And they
hospital
sometimes don't
trust.
communicate with each other, which makes it harder for.
So I know you know, but the NHS spent several billion pounds on trying to get a national linked-up database system, which ultimately failed. A lot of it was down to patient confidentiality and governance issues, but we don't have the ability to share information particularly easily across different parts of the NHS and certainly across the country, which is a big problem.
Yes. I think it's been a problem for many years. I think still a problem till now, and I'm not sure how long it's going to be a problem, because it's important to get everything unified under one electronic system.
Indeed. Even today, after a scan that you did for me and reported, I've had to specifically ask for the scan to be transferred electronically to one of the local hospital trusts because it's not done automatically. So there's an additional,
Another step,
yeah.
Let alone that sometimes you report a scan and it doesn't show in the system, like what happened last week as well with one of the patients. It was reported, done,
That's happened.
it didn't go through, and I had to re-push the button again, which is, IT is amazing, but it has its own frustrations as well.
It does, and that is part of it. And the difficulty that trainees will have is how different the systems are that they'll be working with. And it goes back, it's a form of communication using these IT systems. It's imparting information one way or another. And to actually get to the fundamentals about these different IT systems is very important. And as I said, they're very different from different hospital trusts.
Absolutely.
So you have to get to know them straight away. Now, most people will be they're transferable skills. It doesn't matter which country you come from. IT is IT,
definitely.
but there is quite a lot of difference and variation, and you need to know that to be able to be an effective doctor and to be an effective trainee. If you can't use the systems, then you're not going to be of much use as a team player.
I think using the system is a way of communication as well. And you highlighted at the beginning, communication is a key in any successful job. And going to communication again, because it's really important. What would you suggest, or what do you think the best way for overseas doctors to communicate in the theater room? So I know theater room has different rules everywhere in the country and everywhere in the world. And what would you say? How would you want overseas doctors to behave or to act in the theater room?
So I think when we're talking about communication between different people, there is a very important difference between the way a lot of doctors have been brought up and their training and the systems that are in place back home compared to the UK. And what I mean by that is that I found when I've travelled abroad and gone to different places that there is still very much more a hierarchical system of working, and it is not really encouraged for junior doctors to speak or say anything or ask questions. Now that is very different in the UK. Now I'm not asking for people to be stupid and ask stupid questions for no good reason, which does happen and is quite annoying. But there is an expectation that if you've got something to say or you've got a valid question, to actually say it or ask. And that's very important for safety as well. People see things going wrong, and you see time and time again that someone knew something, didn't say anything about it because they were too scared to say anything. And in the UK, it's definitely, and there will be variations on personalities, but in general, it's favoured if people have the ability to speak up. Now, teamwork is a big thing because hierarchical systems mean that a lot of junior doctors don't really want to speak up or say much. It can be difficult for them to flourish within the system within the UK because there is an expectation, even though there is levels of doctors, that you should be able to speak to anybody at any level at the same level.
Gosh.
So I would expect my best junior doctors, year one doctors, to speak to me like a person, like a friend, if you like, who will be able to impart the knowledge that they have that I don't. Now, the junior doctors will be on the wards. They'll see the patients on a day-to-day basis. I'm not there all the time. I understand that there is a lot of information that they have, and I've not even seen it. I might not have seen the patient for a couple of days. I need them to effectively communicate to me what's been happening, what the problems are, and in them to effectively communicate it, not in 100 words, but in 10 words.
Yeah.
Keep it brief, short, simple. And that's a really difficult thing to do accurately. You need to be highly intelligent and you need to have good communication skills. But if you can manage to do that, then you'll flourish as an effective team member within the UK.
It looks like I mean, thank you again for sharing this in depth about communicating and how to flourish. It looks like communication is really a key as a doctor. I mean, in every job, you need to have good communication skills, but as a doctor as well, especially overseas doctors, they need to concentrate more on how to improve their communication abilities and how to understand how to act in different, like how to act in outpatient clinic, how to act in theater, like you said. But I want to give them, from your experience, how actually they should act in a theater, in a colorectal, patient you have. How do you want them to act with the team? How is the best way to see for them to flourish?
Yeah, so I think if you're going to theatres, make sure you're prepared. Know the operations that are being done on that day. A lot of trainees, a lot of junior doctors, the way that the system works in the UK, they might not want to be surgeons. In the first 2 years, it's generic training. So a lot of trainees will come to theatres and they don't know what we're doing. They don't know the operation. They might have only been to theatres a handful of times. Okay. And therefore, it's very difficult for them to flourish in that environment because they don't really know what's going on. So the first thing is clearly to actually have a knowledge, understand the operations. So if they're coming to theatres, look at what operations have been done. Okay. Go and look them up, revise them, find out what it is, find out alternatives. Come to theatres prepared with some knowledge so that you can actually interact.
Very valuable.
And if you have that knowledge, then you will be able to have a conversation with, whoever it is, a SHO, a registrar, even a consultant, if they're prepared to sit down and have a chat with you. Explain things further, talk about the nuances of surgery. Get involved. Always be positive. Don't be that shrinking violet sat at the back, not saying anything, hiding away, trying not to get into people's, space. Make sure that you're visible. Be part of it. Try and be interactive if you can. And I think those are very important. And that goes with good communication and teamwork. And if people are too quiet, if they don't get themselves involved, if they don't know what's going on, then me as a consultant, I'm going to ignore them. I won't even know your name.
Of course.
And I'll forget you within 20 minutes. So it's very important if you come in that you're positive, positive without being arrogant. Arrogance is a massive turn-off.
Of course.
So don't be arrogant.
Of course.
But be interactive, and that's very important.
That's really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Welcome.
What about dealing with nurses? I know you said about being visible with you as a consultant.
So now we're starting to talk about culture. So again, there's variations in culture with the UK and maybe different countries from people, and that's not just nurses, but it's actually patients as well. So we've spoken a little bit about the difference in culture in terms of the medical staff and how you might speak to people, how you would expect teamwork to be different. It's less hierarchical than some of the countries that they might be coming from. But in terms of staff, like nurses, ancillary people such as physiotherapists, occupational therapists, dietitians, everybody is equal. Okay, you cannot come into the UK and expect to be a doctor who just tells the other services of what to do, because if you did that, you would very rapidly become a difficult doctor, and it would you would find your life to be much more difficult, because in the system that we work in, it's not the system where doctors will just tell people what to do and it all gets done. You will find often that because of the teamwork approach, that there are lots of different factors in how the patient is looked after. Doctors is one aspect of that.
Sure.
Good nursing care, and we have a very powerful nursing union, great nursing staff who will be tremendously helpful if you treat them well. If you treat them badly, speak to them badly, they will make your life very difficult. And if you're a junior doctor and the nursing staff have been around for many years, you will find that they will know the consultants, they'll know your team, and they will tell people, they will share what their feelings about you are. So you have to be very careful, and you have to be nice, and you have to don't compromise on quality if there's a difficult situation that you believe in. But if there is a difficult situation, gain help, ask someone else. But yes, you have to be very careful about communication with other staff, treating people as equals, and I think that's very important. And it also leads into patients, because I think the patient journey in the UK is very different, and patient power, patients' expectations, what people have been told to be able to expect in terms of treatment at the NHS hospital can be quite different. It is quite a shock, I think, to a lot of international medical graduates that come to the UK to find that patients are very willing to ask you questions about your decisions. And this might not be the case back home.
Sure, yeah.
And it can be really quite shocking that a doctor is being questioned by a patient. And I think that happens very frequently. And I think that's something that you have to get used to, and you have to be able to justify your actions and your decisions. Now, if you're confident about what you do, that's not a problem. And in fact, your knowledge and communication skills will therefore lend to a great deal of trust. And one of the greatest things that I think about doing medicine is actually building a rapport with the patient and actually having that almost like bond between the two of you. And that can really help to explain things for the patients who are going through a very difficult time. My speciality, as you know, is colorectal cancer surgery, inflammatory bowel disease. We have some very difficult patients and very difficult situations. To be able to have that ability to speak to people and explain things, even when things are not going particularly well or very difficult situations, that's a really powerful tool. And that's something is sometimes maybe seen as a subtle skill, but it's very powerful.
Massive. Actually, it's massive.
And if you can master that skill, then you're going to do very well doing medicine.
You're right, 100%. And I think just to add to this, and that's very powerful what you said, is doctors who are getting sued you're less likely to get sued if you are empathetic and good in communication and competent.
Absolutely.
And you get more sued if you are less empathetic and not good in communication, even if you are more competent.
Yeah.
Which is when
That's a lesson I learned very early on with my first few years. If you can build that rapport and that communication with the patients, that will make your life so much easier. And I think that's very important, that when people come over, they don't have the arrogance of a doctor that they might have brought with them from a different training scheme. Be humble.
Yeah, be humble. Yeah. And before we leave the operating theatre, has there been anything happen in the operating theatre that made you laugh, from overseas doctors, from anyone in the theatre, that you weren't expecting, like, just happen? Or how could this even happen? How could you ever say this?
I can't think of anything just off the top of my head, actually, Mo. I mean, there's lots of times that you laugh in theatres, some of which is specific to being in theatres and doing surgery, which people outside of theatres might not understand, and sometimes there's a bit of black humour. There are certain things that people insert them into themselves, which usually causes a degree of humour. I think that most of those situations are probably best left in theatre.
Okay, let's leave them theatre then.
I think so.
Right, so leaving out the theatre, and a complication happened to our patients. Okay. And I'm sure we all should be open and transparent about whatever goes wrong with any patient. We should declare it and apologize, and learn from it and move on. There's some reluctancy maybe, from overseas doctors not to mention or document complication because they're worried they may get into trouble or sued. And this is because of what they've experienced in their original country. So what would you tell overseas doctors that they should do and to help them and assist them and to document whatever goes wrong and why and how they should document it?
Okay, so I think that if you're getting into a position where you're worried that something is going wrong or that there's been a complication, then the first thing to do is to not internalize and not say anything. Because it's very likely that thing will then get worse. And then when someone finds out, the first thing they'll do is ask you, why didn't you say something? So it's sharing. So if you're concerned about something, you have to flag it up and you have to share it. Who you share it with, I think, depends on what the situation is and what the complication or problem is. However, sharing and asking for help is very important, particularly as a more junior doctor. People are worried, I find, from particularly international graduates and trainees. They don't want to say the wrong thing. And because there's a fear that if they highlight something, that they'd be thought bad of. And that's discouraged, really, from certainly my personal practice and certainly from the deaneries and the training schemes and our UK trainees. They are now brought up that we should be asking, sharing and making sure that complications or difficult problems and identification of a problem versus a complication is important. And if there is something that's a complication, it may not be your role to actually document it or explain it. Sure. It may well be that you flag it up to someone else. There's some investigations or something that needs to happen, some treatment, and then it may well be that it's documented by other people more senior to yourself. But don't internalize it. Share it, ask for help, and try and work out what needs to happen. That's very important. When we've had complaints and potentially legal proceedings, it's always the situation that if you've seen something and you've acted on it, it's much more defensible and it's much easier to explain. If you've seen something and you don't say anything and there's no action, then that's when there is a problem.
Sure.
And so it is very important to make sure that you do communicate and highlight these things, because even if you try and cover it up, say nothing, it will come back and possibly bite you later on down the line. So that's
so clear message from you there. Don't cover anything up. Don't be fearful of getting blamed of anything. You have to declare it. You have to deal with it or highlight it.
I mean, blame. We don't talk about blame now, do we? In the NHS, difficult things can happen. It's rare for someone to actually have blame apportioned to them to the extent that they end up getting struck off the register. We all know that it happens, and that is often when it's been through a lack of communication, documentation, and inaction. So if you do all of those things, it's very unlikely. So blame is not something that we like to talk about. What we like is we like to learn from problems and complications. And you will find in all of our hospital trusts that we have our morbidity and mortality meetings where potential difficulties, deaths, unexpected deaths in particular, complications are flagged up. And on a monthly meeting, we'll go through these things and see if there's any lessons to be learned. Now, these are anonymous. It may well be that people involved in the cases, it becomes apparent because you're discussing them. But it is important that the message is more about learning from mistakes, complications, than it is about apportioning blame. So that is the culture that we're aiming for. It's a bit like the aviation industry. You know, it's gone down that route a little bit. You know, it's about learning from mistakes rather than trying to blame someone. Doctors are very expensive to train. The UK does not want to, find half of their doctors in jail or struck off. You know, it's not helpful. it's a profession where things will always have a tendency to have outcomes which people don't want, and it's about learning from that and moving forward and trying to make sure that the variables that can be corrected are corrected and don't happen again in the future.
Absolutely. No, thanks for highlighting this. And it's important to make sure that we are doctors. We should be honest and transparent in whatever we do in the NHS and our life. And this is something that is integral to a doctor, to be honest. And to demonstrate your honesty, you have to declare whenever something goes wrong. Be honest about it and talk to the patient, apologize, and learn from it and share the learning. So no, thanks for highlighting this. What's the most thing that you want to talk about overseas doctors? That's something you want to say.
I think we've covered most of it. I mean, I think it's very difficult for them to get jobs. I mean, I was staggered to hear that 120 people are at BHR
in the last 1.5 years.
I mean, I find that absolutely staggering, I have to say. Unless there's a specific link.
There's no link. There is no link.
It's very unusual. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how that's happened, but for a lot of jobs, there are trainee jobs, which are obviously very highly sought after, and of course, in the UK trainees, huge competition to go to medical school.
Yeah.
Just so many people want to do medicine, they never even get to medical school, and then you obviously got medical school and fall out, and then you've got the application for all the FY1 jobs and the FY2 jobs. It's the selection process has been going on for years, and not surprisingly, those trainee jobs are really premium, if you like, and they're looked after very well by the deanery, to the annoyance of local trusts quite often. But then there's lots of jobs which need to be done, which are not trainee jobs.
Sure.
So there's only a handful of surgical trainees, but there's probably at least as many staff grades.
Sure.
So I suppose one message might be that there is different levels of jobs, even at the same level, in terms of there are protected trainee jobs, and there are jobs which are outside of the training scheme, and it is often that the international candidates will come in and they will fill those roles. Now, in terms of progression, in terms of a UK trainee, the progression is kind of built in. You progress from your FY1 to your FY2 to your core trainees and registrar years, and specialist training. It's not the same for international trainees. There's not necessarily any progression built in. So you may find yourself coming and starting to do a job, and then you're still doing it a year later, 2 years later. And so that is a difficulty that they will find when they come over. It may well be that they're stuck doing a job at that level, and to progress is quite difficult. To actually get onto the training scheme to allow them to become a UK consultant is tremendously difficult, and it requires a huge amount of effort and documentation and evidence, and there's really a few people that actually manage to make that transition onto the training scheme to allow them to become consultants. So, yeah.
It's a challenging thing.
It is, yeah. Maybe that's worthwhile, a message, just so that people understand that it's unlikely if you just get a junior job in the UK that's different to a progression pathway towards more senior jobs and consultantships.
I mean, there's nothing wrong of working in a service job, but it depends on what you want to do. Yeah,
it's just the expectations about what you're trying to achieve when you come over to the UK. Yeah.
So when doctors join,
are we still recording, by the way?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. When consultants, I'll ask a question. So when a doctor joins as a junior doctor from overseas or a consultant. Because I also deal with some consultants who have moved from different countries. They came here as a consultant because this is their level, but they're still struggling with the system. How could they ask for help? So junior doctors will have mentorship scheme and what have you, but what about consultants who are expected to know the system, work with the system like you as a consultant in the hospital? How could they ask for help?
Well, I suspect if you're a consultant and if you come over, there's a lot of ingrained behaviour in that person, and you will often be very independent in practice. So the idea of actually confessing to a weakness or a misunderstanding or just not understanding things is actually very difficult. So I think a lot of people won't ask. And they will just say, I'm a consultant, I'll just deal with it and crack on, and it will all be good.
And what do you think of that?
Well, I think there's a risk there, isn't there? There will be some people that have the skills and with a little bit of time and experience will be able to, remodel themselves, their patterns of working and maybe behaviour. And they have the ability to do that and flourish. I think possibly as we get older, as both of us are, we become a little bit more brittle, a little bit more difficult to change in the way that we behave and the patterns of work that we're used to. And that can therefore be a problem. Maybe that's what you're alluding to and what you've seen. A friendly face at that level is what you need. You don't necessarily need a formal mentorship, although it's still valid if there's something like that in place. Yeah. But a friendly face, maybe someone from your own country of background that's already been through the process and understands things. Again, social channels, finding out not just from your own hospitals, but local hospitals or the region. You may well find that there are support services and groups out there that could answer questions and help with that. And within the trust itself, there's always someone that's a little bit further up the management scheme than yourself, even if it's not a formal mentorship. Find someone that's friendly and just ask them. Ultimately, there's always a clinical director who is a medical person who, in theory, always has the best interests of the medical people working within the trust. And if you're finding that there's some difficulties, you could ultimately go to the medical director, and that might be the highest level that you'd want to go to. Yeah. I doubt many people would do that, but that would be an option if you're not finding help anywhere else.
Well, thanks. That's very helpful. The thing which I want to comment on is you mentioned going to someone from your similar background or a forum. Since I've started doing this and educating overseas doctors, I've been now subscribing on these forums. And there are forums like this providing mentorship and advice, but I would see some shocking advice on these platforms. Okay. Actually get them into
like
trouble.
Any social channel, so you have to pick and choose.
Exactly. So when they are not aware of what to do and then they hear from someone who looks senior and give them this horrible advice and then they do it, how would they be able to choose? So this again, I take it, they have to ask for mentorship, but from people who really they got the experience on how to mentor, people understand the system and able to give them the good advice.
So there's always going to be a variable quality of advice that's out there. And I think that if you've made it to consultant level, hopefully you have the ability to sort out what you think is actually good advice and what's bad advice. If you are constantly following bad advice, you're in trouble. So be sensible. Yeah. And, if you think that something doesn't sound like good advice, ask someone else.
Yeah. Definitely. Thanks for sharing that. So one of the things which, patients struggle with sometimes is dealing with patients. One of the things which overseas doctors commonly struggle with is communicating with patients. You mentioned it's top-to-down style in other countries, but here you expect it to be challenged. What key advice would you give to these doctors on how to approach patients and communicate with them? So first, to give them good service, treat them and diagnose them, and avoiding getting a complaint.
Be friendly, be open, and speak to them as a person rather than a patient. That's some of the very basic things. You are obviously in a professional role, so there is some limitations about what you want to share to certain people. You need to be open, honest. You need to be able to answer questions. Do expect questions to happen. It's very easy to miscommunicate by trying to be overly helpful. One of the difficulties that I find is the number of people that speak to patients and tell them slightly different things. So you will find on a ward round, you will see a patient and you'll talk to them and they'll say, Dr. X told me this, Dr. Y told me this, Dr. Z told me this. And it's all slight variations on a theme. So in the process of being friendly, open, and answering questions, you need to know your limits. So you need to be able to say, I'll find out. I'll go and speak to my senior. Don't be trying to second guess what other people will say as well. So the communication, although it needs to be open, needs to be professional, it needs to be accurate. It's far more difficult to go back and tell people, in fact, actually Dr. Y and Dr. Z were wrong, but Dr. X was partly right, and then you had to fill in the gaps.
Sure.
So it's important. So communication, very difficult. The more you do it, the better you get at it. But it is critical. And if you really want to excel and flourish, you need to be able to speak to everyone, your colleagues, your nursing staff, your physios, and the patients. If you can't do that at a level that's acceptable in those different forums, then you will struggle.
Sure. Thanks for sharing this powerful message. Now, leaving the clinics, leaving the theaters, and leaving everything, and flying somewhere. Well, I know you love traveling and flying. Yeah. What was the one city that you visited recently and you really loved it, and you would love to?
Oh, that's easy. I didn't know you could ask that question. But just in half term with the family and my two children who are 18 and 15, we went to Cape Town.
Nice.
And so in South Africa, and it's somewhere that I've wanted to go to for a number of years because I have quite a few South African friends who I've done a lot of sporting activities with, marathons, ultra-marathons, triathlons. And so,
the marathons as well. Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah, marathons, and Ironman marathons. But the Cape Town is a good place to visit from the UK because there's not too much time difference. And so although it's a long flight, there's not too much jet lag.
Okay.
And you can land and just carry on. And there's a beautiful city, a lovely place to visit. You have to be sensible because you can get into places where, you might find yourself in danger. But as long as you stick to the main areas and are sensible, then there's not much rip-off for it. But what a beautiful country. Table Mountain with the clouds rolling off the top. Helicopter trip around Table Mountain, catamaran trip, and hiking up Table Mountain, Lion's Head, and then wine country and Franschhoek, swimming with penguins, cheetah experiences, 4x4, zip wires. Wow. It's all there.
Wow.
Yeah, there's so much.
You're known to go there now.
Yeah. So
you're my next
tour guide for Cape Town. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And you never been there before. It was your first time, right?
First time.
Cape Town. Amazing. In Cape Town, was there anything like funny happened there? Anything hilarious? Anything wasn't expected to happen that happened in Cape Town? I know you had all this fun, wire and helicopter rides and everything. Was there anything that you weren't expecting that you found there? Maybe type of food, anything like you weren't expecting to find it there, but you found it there?
Well, I think one of the funniest things were the guides who struggled with the names. So we had a great day. We had a private trip in a 4x4 car going up a canyon, and then you got to the top, and then you zip wired all the way back down. And the guides, whether they partly did it on purpose, and we had two guides, and they were very funny. They were very professional, but they made the whole day a lot of fun. And they basically made names up for us. So they just called us what they wanted, however they could actually say it in a dialect. That was essentially what we got called. So it was very funny. And watching back the videos from the night, that was good fun. That was very nice.
I'm actually very bad with names myself, so I sometimes forget some people's names, which I'm trying to get better at. But I can see it's hilarious.
Yeah. The other great thing, which was a bit of a surprise, was the kind of swimming with penguins. Because we didn't realise that you could do that. Yeah, there's a very famous place called Boulders Beach, which is just near the Cape, where you can actually go and see penguins. It's quite a big tourist spot, but we picked a very nice little hotel just by the beach there, and because of that, we found that there's another entry point which has a little, very secluded, private little beach, which you can actually pay to go onto.
Nice.
And then the penguins, when they want to come back, they just wander onto the beach and they're swimming around and swim with the penguins and sit on the beach and have the penguins run around, which was a real treat.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I'm glad you had a good time there. And I remember you told me you're going to Cape Town. Yeah, that's amazing.
It's great.
Yeah, I didn't know it was much fun. Yeah, definitely. It's on our list as well, but I haven't managed to go there yet. So, if you always been in surgery, right?
Yes.
You never had anything else. If you had the chance to work something different, any other specialty in medicine,
like radiology.
I was hoping you're going to say radiology.
Yeah.
What would you choose?
What would I choose?
If you're not going to be for 1 day or 1 week or
radiology and interventional radiology is really not a bad choice, because I'm a very practical person and I want to do things. I like the operating. I do a lot of endoscopy as well. So the idea of being able to do something with your speciality is quite attractive. The downside, and I know that you're quite different because you speak to a lot of patients, but you don't have the level of interaction of patients that we do. So I would definitely miss that. So genuinely, I don't think I'd change from doing surgery. I really genuinely enjoy it. I think it has some very highs. It does have some big lows, but ultimately, if you get it right, it's a very rewarding career. Yeah, I think when I was doing my first job, people were very surprised when I went into surgery, because I really enjoyed the medicine side of things. It was very different in those days. You were very active as even a first year junior doctor. And I'd find myself putting central lines in and starting furosemide infusions. In those days, dopamine infusions on the wards in the middle of the night, independently. So clearly I was a very practical junior doctor. But people were quite surprised that I chose to do surgery rather than everyone thought that I was going to do men's.
You love it. You love
cardiology. Yeah, I mean, cardiology is the other thing that it would be potentially of interest, again, because of that
level of
ability to do interventions. But I think I might get tired of the number of times that you get called out at 2:00 in the morning for angiogram and stents. So, yeah.
But you've been trying to do radiology, you always pick up stuff and read my reports and say, why did you say this? So you are trying to...
Well, if you don't report the reports, I've got to look at them myself. I do enjoy looking at the scans, but I appreciate that the level of knowledge on certain scans is really very detailed and particularly important for our cancer work. And just even getting the right MRI scans, the right orientation,
absolutely, it's a skill,
critical, which is still very important.
Amazing, and I'm glad that you love what you're doing right now, because I think many people that I talk to right now, senior doctors, they're kind of not happy with what they're doing. They got into their specialty for whatever reason and they're not happy and trying to change what they're doing. So I'm happy where I am and you're happy where I am. So we're both happy with what we are doing, which is amazing.
Yeah, and that's very important. Happiness in what you're doing is very important, because if you're not happy, you won't want to put the time and the effort in, and you will find yourself becoming depressed.
Of course.
So, the basics of doing your job and enjoying it are critical. There is a lot of disheartenment in certain areas in the NHS because they're under such financial strain and pressures regarding wait lists and times. Going into the management side is often a natural progression from doing clinical work for a few years. You will get invited to become clinical leads. You will want to do various management roles, which are additional things on top of your CVs, often for little money on top of your salary.
No money.
Based on these roles. And it can be terribly challenging. And in fact, actually, personally, I found that doing the management side of things didn't really give me much satisfaction at all. And in fact, stopping doing those roles and concentrating more on the clinical interactions and the surgery side of things with introductions of new technologies. So, for example, we're doing robotic operating now in theatres and taking it from the laparoscopic to the robotic operating. That challenge is great. It's very fulfilling and rewarding. So
Absolutely.
Find your pleasure, find your niche, and develop it and enjoy it.
Thank you. And with finding your pleasure and niche, what's the thing that you found that helped you every single day, that would help you to kind of have a nice, successful day? Like something you start the day with, a habit.
From coffee.
Habits, except from coffee.
Yeah. The obvious thing for me, and this is obviously not the same for everyone, but is exercise. I find it very helpful to be fit, and that, I think, keeping a level of energy is important. I do find that a lot of colleagues have focused very much on their career, and they have not really focused on themselves enough. And in fact, going into their 40s, you will often find that people are overweight and are starting to get problems with blood pressure and diabetes and starting to take medications. And I think it's very important that people do have a slightly more rounded perspective about what the requirements are. And actually, this might have an aspect of international trainees who are still in what we'd call a kind of slightly old-fashioned system where it's a bit more didactic and it's a profession, you dedicate your whole life to doing it. And in the UK, the trainees now are a little bit more, maybe I say worldly wise, it's probably slightly wrong, but they do definitely have more of a perspective about what's happening outside of medicine and their role within it. And they have a wider breadth of interests than ever before. And I think that can only, in general, as long as it's not too distracting, as you can be, but I think it's healthy to have someone who's excelling not just in work, but outside of work in whatever they choose to do. So for me, it's sports, and obviously doing quite a lot of running and swimming and cycling and all the rest of it.
How do you do it? How do you find the time?
If you want to do it, you will make time. This morning, I was up at 5:30 to go cycling in Regent's Park. Yesterday, I was up at 5:30 to go swimming. Before coming here tonight, I managed to get home and do a 10K run.
Wow.
So, that's if you want to do it, you'll find time to do it.
Thank you so much for sharing this experience. You really inspired me to go back to the gym.
Don't do that. Go outside. Don't go to. I don't go to the gym.
You know what I think about overseas doctors? I am an overseas doctor. Is the weather. I have this mentality. We have this mentality that if it's raining, you can't do anything.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you run through rain and you don't.
Well, actually, I think that seasonal affective disorder is underrepresented. I genuinely think this is a thing where in the winter people tend to hibernate and get a little bit more depressed, put on weight, and clearly it's far more difficult to get up early when it's cold and it's dark, and particularly if it's raining in winter, to actually get out and do something. So for me, that's a big thing, because if I don't get out and get the exercise done, early, then that sets me up badly for the day. So yes, the weather is a big thing. However, if you're in the right mindset, you can actually see it as an additional challenge. Okay. You can see it as yourself against the weather. Okay. So on some of the longer distance things that I've done, if the bad weather comes along, then it's a bit more interesting than it just being, boring, cloudy, a bit sunny. I've run in thunderstorms and lightning storms. It's very exciting.
Wow.
So very inspiring. Add the danger level.
That's very inspiring. No, thank you so much for sharing this. It really inspired me to not to go to the gym, but think of something different now. So thank you so much for your time, and really enjoyed the chat with you today and the podcast. And I'm sure everyone enjoyed from the listeners and people that are watching us. So Mr. Hanson, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your thoughts with such honesty and clarity. And your advice today will go a long way in helping overseas doctors watching us today and feel more confident and more empowered and prepared and more supported as they build their career here in the NHS. So thank you again for your time.
Very welcome.
And I hope you wouldn't mind to come back again on this podcast to share other insights for other doctors.
I'd be delighted to.
Yeah,
certainly for you, Mo, an exemplary
thank you so much.
Consultant. Yes,
thank you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.